So NATO has been in the news. It was founded in 1949. And like many things, it arose after World War II and also in response to threats that were coming from the Soviet Union as it was starting to press its own agenda across Europe and concerns as to the threats to Europe and communism. So with the breakup then, during that period of time, NATO's mission was fairly clear. But with the breakup of the Soviet Union um, and then the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was sort of a reevaluation as to what was the mission and goal of NATO. So at that point, there was sort of a search for, I don't know, identity, goal, I think very common to probably most organizations. And so out of that, then they started to look at NATO and now the different threats that were now in the 1990s starting to present beyond what the threat brought to us by the Soviet Union. So there was a change in the way that NATO sort of looked at their role. They began looking outward, so beyond Europe, and that also they began to look rather than just defensively, proactively. So that's sort of been where NATO is. Also during that time, it expanded its member states. It grew from 12 to now 32. So that's now adding most recently with the threat from Russia. So most recently, we added Finland and Sweden. So they are now at 32. So NATO is, as we go forward, NATO has been looking forward to really still a question of now cohesion as they have joined and brought in new groups, new countries. Also, how to be able to move to be responsive, how they pay for many of these things, and who is sort of the leader? Where is the drive coming from out of Europe? If the United States starts to pull back to also look at other arenas within the world. So NATO has its challenges, and we are very lucky to be joined by, I see our speaker right here, Sarwar Kashmeri, and it is a delight. So before I speak anymore and take more time, I think we want to hear from our speaker. As always, we will have the chats. We will, in our usual way, Tyler will introduce the speaker. The speaker will then have about 30 to 40 minutes to speak, and then we will open to questions, first led by the panelists. And then also during that time, please enter in the chats, those of you who are in our audience, and we'll try to get to any of your questions that have not been answered. So without further ado, I do want to introduce Tyler.
Thank you, June, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. As June has explicitly pointed out, our topic this morning is NATO's future. I think the timing is really excellent here, as not only has the organization's 75th anniversary coming up next month in October, but NATO tomorrow on October 1st is transitioning to new leadership. And of course, it has just welcomed two strategic new members, Sweden and Finland. Now, as we're all very much aware, Russia's invasion of Ukraine could pose very crucial challenges to NATO's military capabilities in a future worst-case scenario. So to assess NATO's current posture and future prospects, we have, as June mentioned, a speaker very well equipped to handle this task. It's a great pleasure to welcome Sarwar Kashmeri, who is a widely recognized expert on NATO, to join us today. Welcome, Sarwar. Sarwar is a senior fellow at both the Atlantic Council and the Foreign Policy Association. And as some of you may have seen, he wrote the article NATO's Future in this year's Foreign Policy Association Great Decisions Briefing book. He's the author of NATO 2.0, Reboot or Delete, which more than a decade ago revealed many of NATO's challenges and problems. And more recently, he has widely published articles and hosted podcasts and live video programs on both NATO and China. He's a frequent guest speaker at the U.S. Military Academy, and he's been interviewed on many times on CNN, C-SPAN, and Sky News, and currently teaches a course on U.S. foreign policy at Dartmouth. So Sarwar, welcome aboard, and we very much look forward to your comments on NATO's future. Thanks for joining us.
Tyler, it's a pleasure for me to join you. Sorry I was a few minutes late, but I well recall us meeting on Metro North heading to Manhattan from Mount Kisco, and you from Chappaqua.
Yeah, that's correct. About 15 years ago.
Is it been 15 years?
Well,
you
maybe
don't
12 or
look
13.
a day older.
Yeah, right. None of us look older, though, do we? No.
The June Blanc, you were doing such a good job. I don't know whether you really need me, Tyler. I think we should just have June continue.
That's a thought. Yeah.
Now I know who to call when I get stuck.
Yeah.
So listen, it's very kind of you to invite me. And I must say that it couldn't be more timely. Not just because of Ukraine, but because of the real concern in Europe and in America that we need to somehow fine-tune this relationship, which is very vital, according to me, between Europe and America. And what I thought I'd do, because of this point that we need to do some fine tuning, is what the newspapers and articles and people are thinking on both sides of the Atlantic, is give you a little bit of information on the founding of NATO and what brought it together, and some of the things that we tend to forget, because as Tyler pointed out and June pointed out, that it's now 75 years that this organization really came into being. So let's start there, and I'll try and keep my remarks to the 20-30 minutes that you want, so that we have more questions from you to me. So first of all, NATO came together in 1949. And I want to remind what most of you probably already know, that the NATO treaty was the first foreign policy commitment that the United States had made for 200 years, right? Remember George Washington's famous dictum, whatever you do, don't get involved in Europe, the emperors and all their tribal warfare will suck you in, you'll never get out. And so the United States followed that. And the first time a defense agreement was signed by the United States was the NATO agreement. So I wanted to give you that little bit of perspective. The second point is that NATO was one of the institutions that came out of the Second World War, right? The leadership then of the United States, Europe, especially George Marshall, Eisenhower, and all of these people that also created the United Nations. And there was a very, very close connection when people started talking about a defense alliance, coupling America's strength to Europe's. They said, listen, we've just created the United Nations. So let's make sure that the alliance that we are creating the military alliance that we are creating fits in with what we've created with the UN. And so it was made very clear in the treaty, and I would urge you to take a look at the UN treaty. It's very short, it's about 2 pages, so it'll take you all of 20 minutes of that to get through it, but it's really important to look at that because one of the things that we find when we look at the treaty is this close connection that I mentioned between the NATO treaty and the United Nations, especially in the written dictum that primary responsibility of the maintenance of international peace and security lies with the Security Council of the United Nations. So NATO is intimately connected with what the Security Council does and does not authorize it to do. It's a fact that we often forget, but it came home very, very starkly during the first Iraq War, when, as you know, most of the leading foreign policy experts, I might talk about Mr. General Brent Scowcroft, I might talk about the then Secretary of State, and so on, did not want for the United States to go ahead because the UN had not approved it. And what happened was our largest allies in Europe, France, the United Kingdom, refused to be part of it, as compared to the first invasion of Iraq, the fight with Iraq to have it leave Kuwait, which it had annexed, invaded, right? Everyone joined together. In fact, the Arab states joined together with the United States and Europe to fight Mr. Saddam Hussein. So I just wanted to point out that this has real world impact, this connection between the Security Council and NATO. The second point I want to make is that when the NATO was founded, one of its members, remember this is the Democratic Alliance to safeguard democracy and keep it going. Well, one of the first founding members of NATO was Portugal. And Portugal at that time was a military dictatorship. So one of the founding members of NATO was a military dictatorship. Now, why did we feel it necessary to do this? Because after the NATO alliance was signed, people realized that we didn't have the bomber airplane capabilities that we do now, that we couldn't get to Europe without refueling. And the only place that was ready to go was in the Azores, which Portugal, controlled. And so whether it was a dictatorship or not, military or otherwise, the powers that be said, we need Portugal in. This is important for you to keep in mind because there were a lot of people as NATO continued its expansion, and I do mean a lot of very influential people that felt that NATO ought not to expand to the borders of Russia, and that we need to find some way of bringing Russia into the European security equation. That, of course, didn't happen, but I want you to keep in mind, and there's a reason I brought out Portugal, the founding member, because it certainly is not true that if a country is not a democracy, quote unquote, that it cannot join NATO. I mean, one of NATO's founding members was a military dictatorship. So that's just a point I wanted to make. There was a time, by the way, when Europe and NATO and the US tried to get Russia involved in NATO, but it did not work out. I spent an afternoon with Dmitry Rogozin, who still is a pretty powerful guy in the Putin orbit, when he was the acting ambassador to NATO from Russia. And he gave me all the reasons why it wasn't working out, and he didn't think that this was going to work out. And I'm happy to go into that in some detail if you want. But what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the budget process of NATO, because I know that is also the stuff of headlines, and more than one American politician has picked it and will continue to pick on it, to pick up that thread and talk about why should we be doing this and that and paying all this money. So I'll try to compress this into two very simple thoughts. One, that the budget of NATO is in two parts. One is the common funds, as they're called, and the other one are funds that are used for military deployment. The common funds are the funds that pay for all the overhead, the office building, the headquarters, the secretaries, the assistants. You know, every country that is a member of NATO has an ambassador to NATO. And these are all housed in Brussels in a new building that came up about 5 years ago. And so to run that building, run the communications, to run if you will, the tentacles that pull everything together, there's a budget known as common budget, which countries pay into based on their gross domestic product, the income of that country. And so obviously the larger the GDP, the larger the common budget is. And it's interesting to know that America actually gets a break in this payment, because the NATO countries realize that America does much more than any other NATO country. You know, we have aircraft carriers that are on deployment, we're in the South Sea, all the things that European countries are not able to afford, or if they can afford it in very minute quantities. So that's the common budget. And there's no problem with that common budget. Everybody pays it. It's globally inconsequential. It's the second budget where I would like you to think about for a moment, and this is the military deployment budget. Really important point. There is no budget, no funds in NATO to deploy military forces. So when NATO sends, let's say, a regiment to the Sahara to fight with whoever, the country that is sending the regiment has to pay for it out of that country's overall budget, internal budget. Really important point to remember. So when, let's say, a NATO force is sent into the field, here's a very simple way in which that process works. All the ambassadors sit around a table. The decision has been made to send a force. Nobody votes on that, the consensus, unless somebody says no, because all decisions are unanimous. When they meet, the ambassadors meet, it means that a decision's been made to send a force. At that point, they go around, the Secretary General goes around the table and says, okay, ambassador from France, how many tanks and planes and soldiers can you send? Ambassador from Portugal, how many tanks? That's how a UN force is set up. Again, I'm repeating myself, but really important. Once a country makes a commitment of what kind of arms, ammunition, personnel to send, that country is bound to pay the expense for that. There is no budget in NATO to pay for fielding forces. Really important you understand that. So there was a decision made so about 15 years ago at an annual NATO meeting that countries should spend a minimum of 2%. You're all familiar with that, of their internal budget on defense. And in my opinion, that kind of threw things off kilter, because it's not really important whether a country spends 0.5% or 2% or 5%. Country members of NATO need to spend enough so that when called upon to send forces for NATO, they're able to do it. You all know about this famous Article 5 of NATO, right? Where it's often called the Three Musketeers article, that an attack on any member of NATO is to be considered an attack on all of NATO. And every country is expected to come to the defense or support the defense of the country that has been invaded, right? So first of all, the Security Council needs to say, yes, this was an illegal invasion. NATO, go ahead, fight. Then the countries have to put together a force. And then the country has to send out the force. So whether they pay 2% or 3% or 4%, it behooves the countries, the members of NATO, to be able to send the forces that NATO requires. And a lot of people, including me, think that setting that 2% goal, was not the best thing to do, because you could spend the 2% on whatever you want, and still when you need to send a fighting force, right, you may not be able to do so. So I wanted to make that point, which can lead to some good discussion as we go along. The next point here is whenever the Europeans have started to put together an independent force, meaning Europeans can decide to send a force out in the field without necessarily getting permission from America to do so. The United States rises up, has risen up in arms and said, how dare you do that? And that's another real failing, I believe, in NATO. And the Europeans have come close a couple of times and are starting to come close again to developing a European force, right? I mean, yeah, the European Union is a grouping of countries. It's not a country on its own. So, as is often pointed out, that they ought to be able to raise a European force if they want to, but that has not happened. And a big reason they've not been able to do that is that they've just not created the industrial base to support a Europe-wide deployment as exists in America. We can call on a huge reservoir of money to fund the arsenal that America can feed anywhere in the world. I'm touching on a number of things that I want to alert you to. And the next one is the NATO deployment in Afghanistan. You will recall that the United Nations said, okay, let's send a force to Afghanistan. And that was the force that the Europeans signed up to, and it went to Afghanistan. However, an immediate problem arose, and I would like to read just 3 paragraphs from my book that deals with the problem that I want to highlight. One of the people I talked to, one of the experts I talked to about writing my book, which is NATO 2.0 Reboot or Delete. You can see is no, you can't somehow, so I'll take it down. One of the guys, people I talked to was Nicholas Burns, who is now our ambassador to China, by the way. And here's what he told me. I said, so how did the NATO, the European NATO involvement in Afghanistan work out? And he said, it was very strange because these people went there. This is Mr. Burns talking. These people went there and they expected that there was no fighting. They expected that there was peace and they were going to maintain the peace. And now let me read to you. At the outset, NATO leaders faced considerable difficulty persuading some member states to contribute to the United Nations peacekeeping force in Afghanistan. Many allies committed forces to the NATO operation, then imposed restrictions, they're called national caveats, on tasks these forces could undertake. Almost half of the UN force had some form of caveats, restrictions that allied governments or their parliaments place on the use of their forces. And by the way, this still exists. So the local parliament has to decide what their force can and cannot do. Caveats do pose difficult problems for commanders who seek maximum flexibility in utilizing troops under their command. Some nations will not permit their troops to deploy to other parts of Afghanistan. Others prohibit their troops from participating in combat operations at night. Still others, unless in self-defense. NATO commanders have to shape their conduct of the mission to fit the capabilities and caveats on the troops. And as comparison here, I'd just like you to think about D-Day in Normandy. Just think what would have happened to General Eisenhower's brilliant planning of that with his staff if he had a diary on which every country that contributed forces to the landing had a list of locally approved caveats. We won't fight at night. We won't fight if we are outnumbered. It would have been a very hard thing to feed to do that force. So let me just take a quick look at time. Okay, I'm going to try and wind my side of it up, make sure you have enough information to ask questions. And so NATO, of course, kept expanding because the Warsaw Pact, which was the equivalent of NATO, Soviet Union, collapsed when the Soviet Union collapsed. And that's when the big debate started about, so what do we do with all of these countries who now raised their hands and said, hey, we'd now like to join NATO. And so there was a big discussion about, gee, these guys were guys we were going to fight last month, but now they all want to join NATO. And General Brent Scowcroft, who was one of my prime reference points for my book on NATO, said that maybe we should have thought some more about Soviet or Russian sensitivities, that they were down on the ground, on their knees, their entire empire had exploded. Maybe we ought to have thought a little more about whether we should expand NATO or not. Now, be that as it may, the decision was made to go ahead, and we are now with 36 countries. And I'm one of those, at least in the camp of those who say, great, we are all there together. But gee, it's 75 years since NATO was established. Does the United States need to forever be the engine that runs NATO? And NATO is the richest grouping of countries in the world. Its population is larger than America's, technically advanced at the heart of Europe. Wouldn't it be nice if we had an effective NATO led by Europe? And I'll repeat where I started, which is the transatlantic alliance is a hugely beneficial group of allies. And the United States should pride itself on having such a grouping of countries that stand with it through thick or thin. But rather than let these critiques that are now rising about, are we always going to pay for it? The Europeans need to do their own defense. These need to be handled. And as Americans, we need to face up to this. It doesn't mean a weakening of the alliance. It means giving it time, but setting the stage. So I've been advocating that we immediately offer the Europeans a guarantee that if anyone attacks Europe, over the time it takes for them to develop their force, that America will fully support Article 5. We will, treat any invasion as an invasion of all the countries in NATO, but also set a time limit, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is, that say at the end of that time, we will not lead NATO. We will always be a member of NATO, but there needs to be a European Secretary General of NATO. The top command needs to be a European command, and so on. So I could go on, keep going and talk for another hour on this whole issue, but that's not why you've invited me. I think you all must have some questions now. I've tried to be provocative, but give you enough basic information so that you can formulate your question. And so Tyler and June, let me turn this over to you now.
Good. Well, Sarwar, thank you so much for providing some very important grist to the mill, so to speak. Let me ask the first question, and I know the panel has a number on their own. Now with 32, I think you mentioned 36 members. Have 4 new members joined just in the last week?
No,
I'm kidding, but I thought it was
I'm sorry,
32.
that was my mistake.
Oh, okay.
I think there are 32 to 30, as I recall.
Yeah,
June
okay. Well,
probably has-
anyway,
Yeah.
anyway, with 32 members, NATO has become a very broad, obviously disparate organization. There are several countries, as you're more than fully aware, that tend to be kind of feisty, is the term I would use. Hungary, Slovakia, and to some extent, Turkey. And I'm wondering what is the risk that in an urgent Article 5 type situation, you might get a lone objector like Slovakia, who's got Mr. Fico now in charge, who's talk about feisty, he's overtly pro-Russian apparently, who would actually say, no, I'm not going to agree to implementing anything, even if Putin were, for example, to invade Estonia or Latvia, for example.
That is a really interesting and important question, Tyler. And I think to some extent it would also depend on whether that country was a member of the European Union, as most of the NATO countries are, because as you know, there are large funding mechanisms that connect the European Union's budget to countries for infrastructure, for agriculture, those kinds of things. And so that would be something that they would have to think about. But there's a real possibility of that. And this actually arose from 2 of our closest allies, Germany and France, during the Georgia incident, when it was under Mr. Bush that there was a real push to include Georgia in NATO. And in fact, one of our big name senators used a phrase I still recall, which is, we are all Georgians now, because Russia was just getting ready. There was almost a battle that was expected to be fought. And so the Georgians said, listen, bring us in NATO. And so then there will be a cease and desist. Well, France and Germany said nothing doing. We don't want to antagonize Russia to this extent. And that entire sentiment just died because NATO would not agree to it if France and Germany did not agree to it, or any member for that matter would not agree to it. So yes, I agree that there is a real danger that can happen. And that's why we need to use some real diplomacy internally to make sure that it never happens.
So can we presume that the NATO Supreme Commanders and Council is working behind the scenes to make sure there are none of the negativists can prevail in an emergency situation? I imagine that's the case.
I would imagine that they're. Sorry, Tyler.
Yeah.
No,
yes,
I absolutely think that goes on in the background. But I don't think it's going to be very successful because as a country, we, the United States, have not determined that we want Europe to be an independent military force power. I simply, all the evidence points to the United States wanting to be its leader for the foreseeable future, pay what it takes, have an unlimited credit card that Europeans can use. I'm not saying that's bad or good. I think it's destructive to the long-term alliance as such.
Yeah. Okay, Amy, perhaps you have a question for Sarwar?
Sure. Thank you for a great talk. And I appreciate some of the kind of institutional things that you brought up about the funding. Those are points I think that you don't often read about in kind of mainstream literature. And my question, maybe this is a little more kind of philosophical, but it seems to me that two of the biggest problems during the Cold War were dealing with problems of security dilemmas and misperception. And it feels as if the progress that was made to address those problems in the 1980s and the 1990s, right, treaties and trying to build in mechanisms of transparency, that those have now been unwound and we're back really kind of where we were before. And I wondered, looking forward, is there a role for NATO to play in trying to rebuild some of the trust and address some of these what I think are really deep structural problems between right now the US and Russia, but really thinking about what Europe is going to look like in the short term and longer term?
Wonderful question. And I wish more Americans spend time thinking about this. And you are correct. I want to point out that the Cold War was won without a single shot being fired. It's a remarkable achievement. And in fact, I often like to point out, I'll be at West Point for the rest of the week, beginning tomorrow. And when I talk to cadets that have just joined, I like to point out, I said, before I speak, why don't we take a small break? And I'll leave you with a thought. And the thought is this, that since beginning with the Vietnam War, we've thrust brave military people into battles, and we've not won even one of those. The biggest battle that we won was the Cold War, and that was won without firing a shot. Yes, we went Grenada, Panama, the first Iraq war that the elder Mr. Bush fought under UN imprimatur. But other than that, you name a war, you won it. And so it raises all kinds of issues. I point out that the military has always taken every hill that it was asked to take. But what happened here? Why is this situation? And I think that NATO, when you talk about NATO, we have a strong alliance, Amy, with Europe, right? And to me, I'm a very strong believer in the transatlantic alliance. But that transatlantic alliance goes beyond NATO, right? It's all kinds of things. There's a technical alliance and a diplomatic alliance, and you can go on and on and on. It's a moral alliance. NATO is one part of that. And we need to do whatever we can to protect it. And that's the reason why I'm in the camp of those people who are saying, listen, better to think about this now than when something happens with you thinking that one of the countries might say, hey, we're not going to be part of this. And this all ties into also the influence of the so-called global South, which is lesser developed countries of the Southern Hemisphere, right, which are becoming very influential. You've brought up Tyler, I think you brought up Ukraine, American sanctions on Ukraine. I'll throw that out as an example. All kinds of sanctions. 80% of the world does not support them. 80% of the world does not support the American sanction. By the way, I've just written a report for the Foreign Policy Association that will be released at West Point this week. It's a series of reports called Telegram, and the Telegram 3 is the report that's just been released. And if you go to my website, which is kashmeri.com, KASHMERI.com, you can download that at no cost. All right, and that deals with the influence of these global South countries and what's happening. And I'll give you a quote because it kind of connects with what you're saying. And that is the foreign minister of India, who was in Europe. India is the largest buyer of Russian oil. And you may recall that America is trying very hard to get Australia and Japan and India together as a counter to China in the Indo-Pacific. Right? So here's India buying the largest buyer of Russian oil, which gives Russia a lot of money to buy the weapons that we don't want them to buy. The foreign minister, Indian foreign minister, was asked by a reporter, so why is India sitting on a fence? And the reply was, we are not sitting on a fence. We're standing on our ground. This is the importance of the global South countries, that they're interested in their own national interest, and they've now become wealthy enough, strong enough to be able to do that. So I've thrown a wrinkle into your question, Amy, but I couldn't answer it without layering it with this. Would you like a follow-up on that?
No, I think bringing in the global South is really critical. And it does feel increasingly like Europe is a little bit isolated.
As is the United States, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed.
Carolyn, you have a question for Sarwar? Oh, you're muted, Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, indeed I was. So you and Amy asked about that. Very simple, actually, with question going back to the Ukraine and Zelensky's repeated requests for funding and the ability to go in and actually strike further deeper into Europe. And I wonder if he could comment on that. Deeper into Russia, not Europe, excuse me.
No, I'm happy to comment on it. And I'll ask for forgiveness at the beginning, in case you don't agree with it. I think that war has to end. And I think it'll, my mother always said, don't make predictions, but I tend to make them and get into all kinds of trouble. I think that war will end. I think that war will end with compromises on both sides. I don't think that the land that Ukraine has lost, it will get back. I think that we will come to some kind of an agreement. And a lot of the people I talk to are hoping that the agreement will be that Ukraine can join the European Union, but not NATO. And if you think about why, I'd just like to remind us about Cuba. Separate country. Wanted to get missiles from the Soviet Union to put them in their silos in Cuba. What did the United States do? Not in my backyard, we said. One can swim across that channel, come to Florida. You're not putting any missiles in our backyard, right? In my opinion, in my humble opinion, there's a direct connection to what the Russians have said all along and are saying now. But it also happens that Ukraine is a brave little country, but it has to realize that it is on the footsteps of a huge country. I don't. It's really amazing that the Russians have not been able to do what they wanted to do. But the fact still remains that Russia is a huge country, and there can't be a European security equation without including Russia. So somehow we need to get over this and strike a compromise. Apologies, Caroline, if you don't agree with me. And
Oh, no, not at all. I just was, thank you. No, not at all.
Peter, any thoughts for Sarwar?
Thank you very much for this stimulating talk.
Thank you.
The Atlantic Council, which you know well, has a recent report following forums they participated in, I think, in Warsaw and Helsinki, assessing the balance between the buildup of Russian military might coming out of the Ukraine episode and what's going on with NATO and the US. And the perspective, as I understand it, is that there's a very dangerous period, 2025, 27, when Russia might see that the balance between this buildup is in their favor, or there's a momentary weakness somewhere in the European front, and you could have real conflict. So I appreciate your view, whether this is alarmist or whether there really is imminent danger.
Peter, I want to clarify what you said, but Tyler, with respect, I just wanted to point out that I finished serving my 5-year senior fellow service at the Atlantic Council, so I'm no longer associated with the Atlantic Council. I wanted to just mention that as I answer your question, Peter. Are you
we'll call you a former fellow.
Yes, a former of the Brent Scowcroft.
Former fellow, yeah, okay.
Yeah, of the Brent Scowcroft International Security part of the Atlantic Council. But I want to clarify, Peter, I think what they were referring to is a gap between the Western military forces and Russia. Am I correct about that?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I remember a lunch with Caspar Weinberger, who used to be Reagan's, and I'm not 200 years old, so that's false, whoever told you that. But I remember at that time, Mr. Putin had just become the president. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Weinberger, what do you think of Mr. Putin? And he said, well, don't ever forget that he has earned and won every medal that the KGB has to offer. The Soviet Union Secret Service, the KGB. He may be many things, but he's not a dummy. And I think he realizes, in my humble opinion, that if he were to take on NATO, that he'd really get clobbered. And I mean really get clobbered. I don't think that he would be willing to take that risk. Because then schisms between the European powers, yes, no, distrust between one and the other would all instantly disappear if something like that were to happen. So, I mean, I do believe that the United States needs to have the most powerful forces in the world. There's no question in my mind that we have to do that. But I think that report, in my opinion, that is a bit of an alarmist report, because it continues to stoke this issue of there is a real chance that Russia might invade. And so, yes, if the import of the report is to remind Americans we always need to have the most powerful military forces, then I'm in support of that report. But if it means that there is a chance that war might break out because of Russia or whatever, then I would not be able to support that. Does that answer your question? Would you like to follow up?
If that, with your Tyler's permission, I'd like to do a little follow-up question.
Of course.
We note that I think 14 of the 32 current members of NATO were former Eastern and Central European countries. And a lot of this high anxiety seems to come from countries like the Baltics, the ones in the Baltics and Poland. And I'd like to ask, how important do you think the emerging leadership of these Eastern European countries, both in EU and NATO, how important is that?
You mean for the countries?
For the overall security strength of Europe and for the direction of Europe as a whole?
So I have a two-part answer for you. One is, I believe the future of these countries lies in the European Union. The European Union is the grouping that pulls Europe together. So the first most important thing that these countries need to do is become strong members, supportive members of the European Union. Meeting with with one of the American defense secretaries and the head of the Navy, China's Navy, some years ago. They were talking about Taiwan. And the American Defense Secretary, who I personally know, became quite, how shall I say, tough about Taiwan. He said, you know, we have a treaty with Taiwan. So we just want to make it clear that, you know, we're heading into trouble if this continues and so on. And so this is a first-hand quote. The general who heads the Navy said, are you telling me that an American president would balance the existing of Ukraine with that of Taiwan? I'm sorry, balance the existence of San Francisco with that of Taiwan. A very, very pointed question. I'm sure if you all think about it, you might differ a bit, but it's worth thinking about. If the worst happens in Taiwan, which I don't believe it will, and let's hope not anyway, I often think of that quote. Are we going to go to war over Taiwan, knowing that 10 minutes later there won't be a San Francisco or a Washington, D.C. left? So it's not a direct answer, Peter, but this foreign policy, the more you get into it, you know, it's like what is that famous Churchill saying, that it's a riddle and an enigma, and I've forgotten it now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I've
So
got a
Tom-
quick follow-up question that relates to Peter's question. Just quickly, as you know, there's been immense criticism of the disparity of military weapons types within NATO. In other words, French missiles don't match British missiles. The artillery done by Germany is totally couldn't be used by you know, Slovakians, et cetera,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Yes.
This is a real problem, and I think a lot of militarily aware observers think that NATO would have a hell of a time mounting a significant reaction to a full-blown war with Russia, just because the systems are so contradictory and don't work well together. Now, I know they're aware of this, but are you confident that all the key providers of weaponry can kind of get together and decide, okay, you know, Britain is going to do all the artillery and France is going to do all the missiles, and there won't be other conflicting weapons types, if you see what I'm saying? So just
Absolutely.
curious.
Absolutely, Tyler, and thank you for asking that question. It's very apropos. I mean, if I remember my numbers correctly, there are 14 different types of battle tanks, over a dozen separate fighter planes, probably 20 or 30 frigates and ships of different manufacture. So it's a very real issue. And I'm not confident that this will happen. And there's another bigger issue, which is the infrastructure. Many of the bridges that connect European countries, date back to imperial times, and they aren't wide enough to take the huge Abrams tanks, for example. All of that is being rectified. But I go back to what I said a few questions ago, which is the US, needs to take a leadership in letting the European Union develop a muscular force and not always say you can't do that. We want to be the leader of the free world, so we want to take charge of it. That's where we are. And it may have been really necessary at the end of the Second World War because all the countries were flattened. We were the only power standing. If we hadn't done it, Russia would have gone across and probably taken over all the big countries. But today, 75 years later, it's a different situation. We need to be focused, if I may just digress, in thinking about how are we going to work with China. They're not going away, right? This morning, there's a report that they've developed a photovoltaic battery, which, as you know, is an important part of the next generation of automobiles. They've developed one that soaks in solar power. So you have a photovoltaic battery that could theoretically, hasn't been tried, but run forever. I mean, this is a country that now has more patents than the United States does. Yeah. Numerous military computer models are shown in a South Sea Island fight. America will not prevail. And so on, so on, so on. So we have some important fish to fry, and we need to let these people go ahead and do what they need to do.
Yeah. And that leads to the theme that we are more focused now, obviously, on Southeast Asia and China than we are on Europe in a general sense.
Well, I mean, we won't get into that. I'm welcome to come back and talk about that.
That's a different subject, yeah.
It's a different subject. And this morning I had a conversation. Some of you know I host a half-hour program that deals entirely with the US and China. And this morning I had one of the real stars from the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, Zungian Zoe, who talked about the issues between China, economy, and so on. And if you go to the website of this program, which is Polaris, as in the star, -live.com, you get her program from this morning. It's a live program, and so there are a number of questions on that. So yeah, Tyler, sorry, I'm holding up the crowd.
Yeah.
So Tyler, we have a couple of questions that have come in from our audience that I'd like to just read.
And I know Naomi has a question too, I think.
Okay, let's let the audience come in first, if you don't
mind. May I make a quick point? I apologize to do this.
No, that's fine.
But I have a deadline of 10:15. I'll need to get on to a Deutsche Welle interview a couple of minutes after that. So if we can use that, Tyler, I'd appreciate it. Please go ahead.
Okay, that's fine. That's good. Yep.
Okay, the first question, please project the impact of the presidential election in the US. The other question is, if Russia gets Ukraine, where does it leave Poland and other neighbors?
I'll reverse the order of my answers. I will maintain what I said, which is Mr. Putin may be many things, but he's not dumb. He's not about to take on NATO or a NATO country because it knows that the real sword behind that is the United States, as well as some of the bigger European countries, Germany, France, and so on. So I don't think, in my opinion, anything can happen. But I don't believe that that's going to happen. And I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question?
Please project the impact of the presidential election in the US.
Mixture of mystery, bewilderment, hold your breath.
We are.
That's the best I can do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing, I love your bow tie.
That's my club in New York.
Okay. And the second one, a lot of our military equipment is much older than our military people. And held together with rubber bands and gum. Where does that leave us? And I'm sure that's true in European countries, in NATO as well. So the combination of having to coordinate in tough times and using, as you said, infrastructure issues, equipment issues, incompatibility. So your mother will hate me, but what's your prediction?
Well, some of what you just said is indeed true. People who watch the defense procurement and the military in the United States often wonder why some of the most brilliant people in the world, and with $1 trillion budget, how can this be? How can this be? And but it is true, and part of it, you know, is that this whole area is changing so rapidly now. I mean, look at what's happened to the value of large tanks. Ukraine has made mincemeat of the Russian armor, right? Using, and sometimes, I'm exaggerating, but at sometimes drones from Walmart. I mean, what does all of this forecast for military equipment? So some of it is R&D, some of this is the ability to think in unexpected ways, you know. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about it, but I would be concerned about it. But I wouldn't be overly concerned about it, because there is a force within the military that replenishes. And we'll do it one way or another. I mean, part of the reason also, don't forget, is Congress. Right? You take a new submarine project. The manufacturers have learned to divide up the manufacturer over a number of states. So most of the heavy duty, expensive weapons are made in at least 11 or 12 or 15 states. Why? Because if someone tries to kill it, you know, then 15 state senators say, oh, not on your life. Right? I remember then Secretary Chuck Hagel, there's this plane called the Warthog, which was designed to kill tanks on a battlefield in places like Afghanistan. When they were talking about the budget, he said, you know, let's think about taking that money and putting it in other kinds of equipment. And that obsolete fighter plane still runs, still flies. It's being maintained, some are being produced. So Congress does not let, in many cases, the military do what they would like to do. That's another piece of what you said.
Thank you.
Sarwar, quickly looking back about 20 years ago, I think I'm right, when NATO kind of offered a friendly suggestion, shall we say, to both Ukraine and Georgia that they might want to think about joining NATO. I think I have that right. Do you think that Putin's reaction to that is what really stimulated his eventual invasion of Ukraine? In other words, he was so irked and irritated that conceivably Ukraine might become a NATO member, not to mention Georgia, which is a separate subject. But do you think that provoked him ultimately to invade Ukraine 2 years ago?
Good question, Tyler. It well might have. I would propose, however, that it was the objection from some of our biggest allies in NATO, Germany, France, who were totally opposed to either of those scenarios.
Right, I know that, but just the thought that
Yeah.
there
And,
might
and
be
I don't
considerable.
have any, I mean, nobody, wants a thorn on their side when it comes to defense. And just like the United States did not want a Soviet outpost in Cuba, I'm sure Russia doesn't want an American outpost on its border.
Of course, yep.
We don't like to say this, but I mean, I think it's common sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, Sarwar, thank you very much. I think we've got you right about at 11:15 our time, or 10:15 your time.
Thank you
So
so much.
thank you very much for a comprehensive and entertaining assessment of NATO, and we will hope that it can get its act together and be enough of a resistant threat to Putin so he won't try to, pull anything off.
Indeed, and you've got
Really?
very engaged and very bright people who are in this audience that I was talking to, and I hope you will continue your research, your reading about NATO. But I'll repeat where I started, which is I think the transatlantic alliance is terribly important. NATO is a very strong part of it. America should always be a part of the alliance. And so whatever we think, we need, in my opinion, we need to constructively think, how can we keep that going? And
Yeah.
we're not on the right path, according to me, at this point. Thank you
And
so
one-
much for being
No,
attentive.
Thank you
And
so
thank
much.
you
Come
very
back
much.
again.
Thank
And
you.
I hope that you will also do come back and talk about China with us. I would like to remind everybody that we do have a speaker coming on October 21. That is going to be, I'm going to massacre his name, Bart Sajik from the German Marshall Plan, and he's going to be speaking on leadership challenges that are going on right now in Europe. So we look forward to seeing you then, and thank you for coming. And so Sarwar, so thank you so much again for being with us.
No, you're welcome, June, and you have a great outfit coming to you. The German Marshall Fund is a very, very savvy organization, and I know a number of people in it. You're in for a really stimulating talk.
Thank
Good
you
to
very
know.
much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all for
Bye.
coming. And thank you
Bye-bye.
again, Sarwar.
Thank you,
Bye,
Tyler.
everyone.
Thank you, all of you.